The morning began the way every morning began in Homelander's world, with a carefully staged victory and a camera angle designed to make him look like a god. Somewhere over the coast of California, a hijacked cargo plane had been guided into a controlled descent, its supposed terrorists neutralized before the news cycle even began. Vaught's producers had timed the rescue perfectly, cutting to the wide shot the moment the sun caught the edge of his cape. He landed on the tarmac with that practiced smile, the one that had been rehearsed in mirrors and refined by focus groups, and the crowd behind the barricades screamed his name until their throats went raw. Anchors called him humanity's greatest protector. Children raised their small hands toward the sky, as though he were a passing miracle. He believed every word of it because belief, when repeated often enough, becomes indistinguishable from truth. Later that afternoon, inside a Vought research facility buried beneath the Nevada desert, an experimental energy array pulsed to life. The scientists spoke of dimensional resonance and quantum bleed, phrases Homelander only half listened to as he hovered above the observation deck, arms folded, a bored king inspecting his empire. He was there because the cameras were there. He was always there because the cameras were always there. Then the machine screamed, a sound no metal should ever make. The lights bent inward. Reality itself folded like paper crushed by an invisible fist and a wound opened in the air. He tried to fly away. He could not. Something pulled him through. There was no falling, only a sensation of being unmade and reassembled, and when the world returned, it returned in a different shape. He hung above a city that looked like Manhattan but breathed like something older and stranger. Skyscrapers he did not recognize pierced clouds tinted faintly green. Enormous banners on the sides of buildings displayed faces he had never seen, heroes and monsters whose names meant nothing to him. He hovered there, waiting for the panic, waiting for the flashing phones, waiting for the worshippers. Nobody looked up. A taxi driver honked at a pedestrian. A vendor turned meat on a grill. A woman argued into her phone about rent. He drifted lower, close enough that his shadow crossed a busy sidewalk, and still no one froze. A teenager glanced at him, shrugged, and kept walking. Two men pointed briefly, laughed, and returned to their coffee. A little boy tugged his mother's sleeve and asked if that man was a mutant, and the mother said probably, "Honey, keep walking, we are late." Mutant. The word landed in Homelander's chest like a stone dropped down a well. He descended into Times Square expecting the traffic to stop. It did not. He landed in the center of a crosswalk and people simply walked around him. A cyclist muttered something impolite as he swerved past. A street performer in silver paint kept dancing for tips a few feet away, unbothered, as though a floating man in a cape were less interesting than a good song. Homelander turned in a slow circle, searching for the recognition he had spent his entire life earning, and found nothing but the indifferent hum of a city that had already seen too much to be impressed. Above him, the enormous screens that lined the buildings flashed a breaking news alert. A Sentinel had activated in Brooklyn. Live footage showed a massive robot the size of a cathedral tearing through a rooftop while civilians ran and heroes he did not recognize flew to intercept. The camera cut away from him without ever having cut to him. Somewhere in that moment, a small piece of him he did not know existed began to crack. He tried social media. He found a phone dropped on the pavement, still unlocked, and searched his own name. Nothing. He searched his face using the image the phone captured of him in reflection. A trending page loaded. He appeared briefly, ranked far below a viral clip of a talking raccoon fighting a purple giant, below a mutant rescue in Westchester, below a debate about whether Dr. Strange had been seen shopping for groceries. Someone had captioned his photo with a shrug emoji and the words "another new guy." Another. He crushed the phone in his fist without realizing he had done it. Powder drifted from between his fingers like ash. For a long time he simply stood there, breathing too fast, listening to a city that would not sing his name. Far to the north, in a quiet mansion surrounded by autumn trees, an older man sat very still inside a chamber of curved silver panels. His fingers rested lightly against his temple. Cerebro hummed around him, its lights mapping the minds of the world in soft constellations. Charles Xavier had felt many minds in his life. Frightened mind, brilliant mind, broken mind. Minds that carried galaxies inside them. But this one was different. This one felt like a child screaming inside the body of a weapon. This one felt like a boy who had never been held, wearing the skin of a man who had never been told no. Xavier opened his eyes slowly. He looked at the coordinates blinking softly before him. Manhattan, not a mutant, he thought. Not exactly. Something else. Something loud and lonely and dangerous, dropped into a world that had already learned how to survive worse. He removed the helmet and folded his hands in his lap. For a moment, he simply listened to the wind moving through the trees outside, the way one listens before a storm. Then he reached for his phone and called Scott. Homelander needed to be seen. It was less a decision than a hunger, the same instinct that drives a starving animal toward the smell of smoke. If this city would not look at him on its own, he would make it look. He rose above the rooftops and searched for the loudest thing he could find, and within minutes his enhanced hearing caught the sound he was looking for. Panic. The distinctive crackle of energy weapons. A pocket of chaos 3 blocks east, near a shuttered warehouse where a small group of young mutants had been cornered by a private security team hired to enforce a registration protest. He arrived expecting to be worshipped as a savior. He arrived expecting the terrified civilians to scatter into his shadow and thank him for existing. Instead, he found something he did not know how to interpret. The civilians were not running from the mutants. They were running toward them, forming a loose human barrier between the frightened teenagers and the men with rifles. An old woman with a cane stood between a boy whose skin shimmered like blue glass and a soldier twice her size, and she was not begging. She was shouting. Not for help. She was shouting at the soldier to be ashamed of himself. Homelander landed hard between them, cracking the pavement. The shock wave rolled outward. People stumbled but did not flee. A father pulled his daughter behind him and did not look away. A shopkeeper stepped out of his doorway with a broom in his hand, ready to swing it at whatever came next. These people had lived through Sentinels tearing through their neighborhoods. They had lived through Magneto lifting bridges into the sky. They had lived through apocalypse, promising the end of the world, and through mornings when they woke up unsure if the world was still there. A man in a cape was not enough to make them run. He tried anyway. He raised his voice, that trained broadcast voice, and told them to stand back, that he was here to help. Nobody moved. A woman in the crowd laughed, not a cruel laugh, a tired one. The kind of laugh a person gives when they have already been through this exact scene too many times with too many different men. He turned to the young mutants and told them to surrender, and one of them, a girl no older than 15 with sparks jumping between her fingertips, looked up at him with the flat, unimpressed stare of someone who had spent her childhood being told she was a monster by better-dressed monsters than him. He lifted a hand toward her. He never got to lower it. A red beam split the air between them, wide as a train and precise as a scalpel, and slammed into the wall behind him without touching a single civilian. The impact left a perfect circle scorched into the brick. Homelander turned slowly. Standing on the fire escape above the alley was a man in a dark uniform, visor gleaming, one hand raised to the side of his head where his fingers rested lightly on a control. Cyclops did not shout. He did not posture. He simply said in a voice used to being obeyed, "Stand down." Homelander laughed. It was the wrong response. He knew it was the wrong response the moment the wind changed. The sky above the street darkened in seconds. Not slowly, the way real weather darkens, but decisively, as though someone had reached into the atmosphere and turned a dial. A woman descended from that darkness with her cloak spread wide, her white hair rising around her face like a crown made of lightning. Storm did not speak. She lifted one hand, and a wall of wind pressed Homelander backward, not painfully but immovably, the way an ocean presses a stone. Every time he pushed against it, the pressure only matched him. He could not find its edges. He could not intimidate it. Then something puffed into existence beside him with the sharp smell of sulfur and vanished again before he could turn his head. Nightcrawler reappeared behind a group of children, gathered them under his arms, and was gone. Reappeared on a rooftop, set them down, waved politely, and vanished once more. Homelander lashed out with his heat vision at the space where the mutant had been half a second earlier, and the beam struck only empty air. He tried again. Empty air. Empty air. It was like trying to punch a rumor. Something hit him from the side then, low and hard and unrelenting, and he found himself rolling through a parked car and into the far wall of the alley. When he stood, a short man in a leather jacket was walking toward him through the smoke, cigar still lit, 3 long blades gleaming from each fist. Homelander unleashed the full width of his heat vision into Wolverine's chest at point-blank range. The jacket burned away. The skin beneath blackened and split. Wolverine kept walking. The wounds closed as fast as they opened, steaming, and the man on the other side of them did not even blink. The fight, if it could be called that, ended without a winner. Storm's winds pushed Homelander back into the sky. Cyclops' voice, still calm, told him to leave and to think. Nightcrawler was already gone with the last of the children. Wolverine simply stood in the alley watching him rise and lit a fresh cigar off the smoldering edge of his own jacket. Homelander flew up into the clouds and hovered there, chest heaving, and for the first time in his life he understood something with absolute clarity. These people were not afraid of him, not because they were brave, because they had fought worse. He was to them a Tuesday. Charles Xavier chose diplomacy the way a surgeon chooses a scalpel, with precision and without illusion. He did not believe Homelander could be reasoned with in any ordinary sense. He believed only that violence would create another martyr, another headline, another reason for the world to tighten its fear around the necks of the mutants he had spent his life protecting. So he asked to meet. He sent the invitation through channels the newcomer would recognize. A broadcast on a frequency Homelander's suit could not help but pick up, and he offered a place, a time, and a promise of safety. To his own surprise, Homelander came. They met on the roof of a hotel in Midtown, a neutral place chosen because it was public enough to discourage escalation and quiet enough to allow words. Xavier arrived first, alone in his chair, wrapped in a coat against the October air. Homelander landed on the far edge of the roof, slower than usual, and did not speak. He looked at the old man in the chair and could not decide whether to laugh or to leave. He did neither. He stayed. Xavier began gently. He said he understood that Homelander was far from home. He said he had felt the tear in reality and had felt the mind that came through it. He said he was not there to judge, only to listen, and only to offer, if the offer were welcome. A place where a man of Homelander's abilities might learn what those abilities could mean in a world already crowded with wonders. He did not say savior. He did not say hero. He chose smaller words on purpose. Words like rest, like time, like help. Homelander scoffed. He told the old man he did not need help. He told the old man that where he came from he was worshipped. He told the old man that this dimension was clearly broken, that its priorities were wrong, that its people were confused. His voice grew louder as he spoke, and the louder it grew, the more Xavier heard beneath it. The tremor. The plea disguised as a boast. The child inside the man standing at the edge of a stage begging not to be sent back to the dark. "May I?" Xavier asked quietly. Just for a moment. Just to understand. Homelander did not answer. He also did not refuse. Xavier closed his eyes and stepped, with the care of a man walking into a burning house to look for a photograph, into the mind across from him. He had touched many minds. He had walked in the halls of madmen and gods. He had felt the interior architecture of Magneto's grief and the wild, migratory storms of Jean's power. He had once shared thoughts with a being older than stars. Nothing had prepared him for the room he found inside Homelander. It was not a room. It was a hallway that never ended, lined on both sides with glass tanks, and inside each tank floated a version of the same small boy at a different age, and every one of them was screaming without sound. There were no windows. There were no doors. There was only a distant hum, like a fluorescent light that had been left on for decades, and the smell of antiseptic where memory should have been. Xavier walked the hallway with the patience of a father searching for a lost son. He passed a tank where the boy was 5 years old and being lifted by strangers in gloves. He passed a tank where the boy was 10 and had learned to smile because smiling stopped the tests for a while. He passed a tank where the boy was 15 and had learned that anger was the only thing that felt like power, and power was the only thing that felt like love. Further in, past all the tanks, he found a small figure sitting in the dark, arms wrapped around its knees. Not the man he had met on the roof, the child underneath him, the one who had never been held, the one who had learned to build a god around himself because the boy inside would not survive being seen. The child looked up at Xavier. Its eyes were tired. "Nobody came," the child said. "I know," Xavier said. There was no one, the child said. There is someone now, Xavier said. If you will let there be. The hallway shook. The tanks rattled. The man on the roof was pushing back, sensing the intrusion, feeling exposed in a way that no punch had ever exposed him. Xavier stepped back gently, without grabbing, without demanding, and let the door close on his own side. He opened his eyes on the rooftop and found tears on his face that he had not noticed forming. You are not evil, he said softly. You are wounded, and someone taught you to call the wound a weapon. For half a second, Homelander's face went slack. For half a second, he was the child in the dark, and he almost let the old man see it. Then something older and louder rose inside him and slammed the door shut with such force that the psychic recoil made Xavier gasp and grip the arms of his chair. Homelander's voice came out low and shaking. Get out of my head. He said it once. He said it again louder. He said it a third time, and his eyes lit red, and the air around him began to shimmer with heat. Xavier did not flinch. He simply lifted a hand and said, I already have. I only wanted to say hello. Homelander launched into the sky without another word, and the sound he made as he tore through the clouds was not a war cry. It was closer to a sob wrapped in thunder. Far away in a quiet garden at the school, Jean Grey stopped watering the roses and turned her face east. She had felt something crack open, not in Xavier, in the man he had touched. Something old and hungry and very, very afraid, uncoiling in the dark like a second heart learning to beat. She set the watering can down slowly. She did not tell the students. Not yet. But she watched the horizon for a long time, and the roses at her feet, for reasons she could not explain, began quietly, one by one, to bloom out of season. Homelander decided in the private way that broken men decide things, that the problem was scale. He had chosen the wrong opponents. He had allowed himself to be surprised. The next time the world watched him, and it would watch him win. So he began to hunt, not villains, not threats. Any mutant with a name loud enough to matter. He would collect victories the way other men collect trophies, and he would arrange them on a shelf until the shelf was long enough to be called a legacy again. He found Colossus first because Colossus was the easiest to find. A man that size did not hide. Homelander struck him in the chest at full flight speed on a construction site in Queens, expecting the impact to fold him in half. Instead, Homelander felt his own shoulder pop out of its socket and heard the sound his ribs made when they met something that did not move. Colossus caught him by the ankle, almost gently, and set him down on a steel beam the way a farmer sets down a chicken. In broken English polished by kindness, the Russian giant told him that fighting was not always winning, and winning was not always strength, and would he like to sit for a moment and consider that? Homelander flew away instead. His shoulder popped back into place in the air. His pride did not. He found Rogue next, in a diner outside Salem Center where she was drinking coffee alone. He assumed the gloves were an affectation. He grabbed her by the wrist to drag her out into the street where the cameras he had bribed were waiting. Her glove had slipped. His skin met hers. He felt it immediately, the pull, the drain. The slow, sickening realization that his own power was leaving him through his own hand and pouring into a woman who had not asked for it and did not want it. She let go before he collapsed. She pushed him back into a booth, told him to sit down, drink water, and think about his choices, and walked out with his laser vision flickering harmlessly in her eyes. He sat there for 20 minutes because he could not stand. He tried Iceman. He tried the full furnace of his heat vision on a man made of water and cold, and watched Bobby Drake simply reform himself from the rain that fell around them, whistling, unimpressed, asking politely if that was all he had. He tried magic and found himself dragged through a portal into a place where the sky was made of teeth and time did not move in one direction. And when Eliana finally let him crawl back into his own reality, he was screaming at nothing for reasons he would not explain to anyone later. He tried Kitty Pryde. He threw his hardest punch. She was standing 3 feet to his left the entire time, arms folded, and asked if he needed a nap. Each humiliation was smaller than the one before, and each one hurt more. The cameras stopped flattering him. He noticed it before anyone said it aloud. The angles were less generous. The music beneath the news segments changed key. The word hero appeared next to his face inside quotation marks, and then, one Wednesday morning, it did not appear at all. In its place, a different word. Superhuman. Then another. Then another, the one he had spent his entire life avoiding, the one he had built his god around, never having to hear. A talk show host, a man Homelander had smiled at through 100 green rooms in his own universe, sat behind a desk in this one and said, with the practiced concern of someone who had done this segment many times before about many different men, that authorities were beginning to describe the newcomer as a threat, not a hero fallen from grace, not a savior misunderstood. The words sat there on the screen in white block letters beside a still image of him screaming at Kitty Pryde in a parking lot while she filed her nails. Protesters gathered outside the buildings he circled. They did not carry his name on signs the way crowds used to. They carried the names of people he had heard in his brief tour of the city. A barista whose cafe he had melted through. A cab driver he had lifted and dropped. A child whose birthday party he had crashed through the ceiling of because he had heard the word mutant and assumed a threat. The parents of that child spoke on the evening news. They did not cry. They were past crying. They said simply that they wanted him gone, not punished. Somewhere in a vault archive in his own universe, he knew, a team of publicists would already be constructing an apology tour. Here, there was no one to build one for him. Here, the machinery that had always turned his failures into feelings and his feelings into merchandise did not exist. Here, when he did something ugly, it was simply ugly, and it stayed ugly, and the world moved on to the next mutant rescue on the next block. He landed on a rooftop at dusk and sat down, which was not something he did. He sat and he looked at his hands. They were still strong. They were still his. But they had begun to feel, in a way he could not yet name, like the hands of a stranger. Every mutant he had tried to break had walked away calmer than he was. Every fight had left him more visible and less seen. The X-Men had a word for people like him in their old case files. He had read it once over Cyclops' shoulder during the diplomatic meeting he was not supposed to see. Filed alphabetically, between other names he did not recognize. Just another entry. Somewhere below him the city sang without him. He listened, and for the first time in his life he heard how loud it was without his name in it. Magneto came looking for him. That was the first strange thing. In Homelander's experience, powerful men made other men come to them. To be sought out was, in his old life, an act of subordination. In this life, Eric Laneshare flew across an ocean and a continent to find him, and did so not as a supplicant, but as a curious craftsman inspecting a strange new tool someone had left on his workbench. Homelander was standing on the observation deck of a half-finished skyscraper in Manhattan when the wind changed and the loose bolts in the scaffolding around him began, one by one, to rise into the air and hang there, spinning gently, like a slow rain that had forgotten which way was down. He turned. An older man stood on the edge of the platform in a long dark coat and a helmet the color of dried blood. He did not float. He did not need to. The building held him up because he had asked it to. He looked at Homelander with the patient interest of a teacher meeting a pupil he had already decided he would not be able to save. "You are the man who thinks he is a god," Magneto said. It was not a question. Homelander started to answer. Magneto lifted one gloved hand very slightly, and the bolts around them stopped spinning and pointed inward, an entire constellation of small, sharp things aligned toward one throat. Homelander closed his mouth. "I have met gods," Magneto said. "I have buried some of them. May we speak?" They did. They spoke for a long time. Magneto sat on a crate of rebar as though it were a throne. Homelander stood because he did not trust his knees. Magneto did not raise his voice once. He asked, first, about Homelander's childhood, and Homelander refused to answer. Magneto nodded as though refusal were the same as answering and moved on. He asked about the world Homelander had come from, about the company that had built him, about the crowd. He listened, and as he listened his face did something that unsettled Homelander far more than anger would have. It softened, not with pity exactly, with recognition. "You mistake fear for respect," Magneto said finally. It was gentle, the way a diagnosis is gentle. "I did that once, when I was very young and very hurt and very certain that I would never be hurt again. I made men and women tremble, and I called it love. It is not love. It is only fear wearing love's clothes, and the moment the fear stops, so does everything you built on it. You are not powerful. You are only loud. There is a difference. You will learn it here whether you wish to or not. He offered him a place. That was the second strange thing. Not a threat. He said that Homelander could join him. Not the X-Men whose patience he considered a slow suicide, but Magneto's own project, whatever it was that year. Some quiet island where mutants and misfits and orphans of experiment could learn what it meant to be strong without being cruel. He said the offer was real. He said he did not extend it often. He said the boy inside the man across from him deserved, at least once, to be asked to sit at a table instead of stand behind one. Homelander laughed. It came out too high and too fast. He told Magneto that he did not need islands. He did not need tables. He did not need old men in helmets talking to him about boys. He was the greatest superhuman in existence. He was Homelander. His name was known on 3 continents. His face sold everything from cereal to warships. He did not join. He was joined. Magneto looked at him for a long moment. Then he stood up. "A pity," he said. "Then let me show you the difference." The battle began without warning and without ceremony. Magneto did not throw a punch, because Magneto never threw a punch. He did not have to. The half-finished skyscraper around them was, to him, a musical instrument, and he began to play it. Beams peeled away from the frame and swung toward Homelander in long, slow arcs he could not evade because there was no direction they were not coming from. He tore through one, and 2 more replaced it, curling around his back like the ribs of a closing hand. He blasted at Magneto with his heat vision. The beams bent around the old man in a graceful curve, drawn aside by the iron in the girders around him, and returned to strike Homelander in his own shoulder. He rose into the sky to escape. The sky did not cooperate. Every car on the street below rose with him. Every street lamp uprooted itself. Every dumpster and fire escape and manhole cover and rebar rod within a mile lifted into the air and hung there, motionless, until the entire skyline looked like a city being disassembled by a patient hand. Then, when Homelander was directly beneath the largest of them, they fell. Not all at once. In sequence. A steel storm choreographed by a mind that had spent decades learning exactly how much a man could survive and exactly what shape of impact would break him without killing him. Homelander was buried, dug himself out, was buried again, dug himself out again, and each time he emerged, another skyscraper had shifted, another crane had bent, another rooftop had leaned down toward him like a curious animal. He had never fought anyone who fought the battlefield instead of the person. He did not know how. He had spent his life throwing his body at problems, and now the problem was throwing the city at his body, and the city was much larger than he was. When it ended, Homelander was on his knees inside a small crater made of what used to be a parking garage. His suit was in tatters. His nose was bleeding. Magneto stood above him, unruffled, coat barely dusted, and looked down at him with an expression that was not triumph. It was disappointment. "You could have been magnificent," Magneto said quietly. "Instead, you were only large." He turned and walked away. The metal in the air lowered itself gently back to earth around them, each piece finding its place, as though the entire city were exhaling. Homelander did not get up for a long time. He should have left. Any part of him that still remembered how to be reasonable knew that he should have left. Instead, he did the thing broken men do when they have been shown one too many times exactly how small they are. He decided to burn the place that had shown him. If he could not be the greatest hero this world had ever seen, he would be the worst thing it had ever survived. He would give them a name to remember. He would make himself unforgettable by making them mourn. He came at Xavier's school at dusk. He came screaming. He came the way a wounded animal comes when it has decided that being feared is close enough to being loved. The old iron gates buckled under the sonic pressure of his approach. The lawn caught fire in 3 places from his heat vision before he had even landed. Students who should have been at dinner ran instead. Teachers moved with the practiced calm of people who had trained for this exact evening for years, herding the young ones toward the tunnels beneath the mansion, sealing the doors, checking rosters, doing all the small unglamorous work that heroism is actually made of. The X-Men met him on the lawn. Wolverine. Others he did not know the names of. They stood in a loose line between him and the school, and they did not posture, and they did not speak. And that silence was the last honor they offered him before what came next. Because Jean Grey walked out of the front doors and past them all. She wore no uniform. She was not even wearing shoes. She walked across the burning grass in bare feet, and where her feet fell the fire went out. Her red hair had begun to lift around her head as though the wind she carried inside her had finally decided to be visible. Her eyes were not angry. That was the thing that would haunt him afterward. He had expected rage. Rage he understood. Rage he could fight. Her eyes were sad and tired and, worst of all, patient. The way an ocean is patient. The way something very old is patient with something very young. She lifted a hand. She did not strike him. Behind her, above her, around her, a great bird made of fire unfurled itself across the sky, wings wider than the estate, and the phoenix looked down at him with an attention so total that every other gaze he had ever received in his life seemed, in retrospect, like people politely pretending not to look. "Let me show you," she said. Her voice was soft. It did not need to be loud. The world went white. He was in a hospital corridor. A woman was crying. He recognized the woman because he had melted the roof of her son's birthday party 3 weeks ago. The son had lived. The father had not. The mother was signing forms with a hand that did not know how to hold a pen anymore. He felt what she felt, not as a description, as a weight, as his own weight. He tried to look away and found that in this place he had no eyelids. He was on a highway. A cab driver he had lifted and dropped. A man named Amir, who had 2 daughters and a mother in Karachi who called him every Sunday, was learning that he would never walk again. Homelander felt the phone call to the mother. Felt the pause on the other end of the line before she began to pray. Felt the exact shape of that prayer inside her chest. He was in a barista's apartment. She was staring at the ceiling. She had not been physically hurt. She had only served him a coffee that was not hot enough, and he had melted her café around her while she stood behind the counter with her hands raised. She had not slept properly since. She was thinking about quitting the city. He felt what she felt when the door slammed downstairs and she flinched, because every door was him now, forever. He was in a green room in his own universe, watching himself smile into a camera the day after killing a man in an alley off 5th Avenue. He felt the smile from the inside, felt how easy it was, felt how much easier each one got. He was a child. He was in a room made of glass. He was screaming without sound, and nobody was coming, and nobody had ever come, and nobody was ever going to come, and he understood. Finally, in a way he had spent his entire adult life refusing to understand, that this was not a wound the world had given him. This was a wound he had learned to give the world. He fell to his knees on the lawn. The phoenix folded her wings. Jean Grey lowered her hand. He was still whole. She had not broken a single bone in his body. She had only, gently, and with a kindness he did not deserve, made him look. The way Xavier had knocked on the door of the room in his mind, she had opened every window in the house and let the light in. He stayed on his knees. He did not stand. He could not. Around him the fires he had started burned down on their own, the way small fires do when the wind stops. The X-Men lowered their weapons. Nobody cheered. Nobody spoke. A boy watched from an upstairs window. A boy whose blue skin shimmered in the last of the sun, and the boy did not look afraid, and he did not look triumphant. He looked mostly sorry. Sorry for the man on the lawn. Homelander wept. He did not know he was doing it until he tasted the salt. He wept the way the child in the glass room had never been allowed to weep. He wept for a long time. Nobody rushed him. The sky opened again 3 days later. It did so quietly this time, a slow red seam stitching itself across the clouds above the Hudson, the same wound in reality that had brought him through, remembering the shape of him and offering to take him home. Xavier was there when it began to open. So was Jean. So was a small handful of others, standing at a polite distance, giving the man on the lawn the dignity of not being watched too closely. Homelander was not in restraints. That was the last thing he could not understand. He had asked, when he could speak again, why he was not in a cell. Xavier had answered simply, "Because your punishment has already happened. Because a cell would be a mercy compared to what you now carry. Because we do not need to keep you. You will keep yourself for the rest of your life." He did not argue. He had run out of arguments. He stood on the lawn in a borrowed coat someone had draped over his shoulders, and he watched the tear in the sky widen, and he waited to be sent back to a universe where his old life was still on television. Xavier wheeled forward. He did not offer his hand. He did not offer his forgiveness either. Forgiveness, he seemed to understand, was not his to give. He only said quietly that if Homelander wished one day to try again in his own world with his own people, the door here would not be closed. It would simply be far away. Homelander nodded. He did not trust his voice. Then he rose slowly and let the wound in the sky pull him back. He came out of the other side above his own Manhattan, above the Vought Tower, above the crowds who were already turning their heads up toward the returning god, phones lifted, mouths open, ready to scream his name. He heard them start. He heard the machine of his old life clicking back into gear around him, the anchors already speaking his name in reverent tones, the producers already cutting to the wide shot, the sun already catching the edge of his cape the way it had been trained to. He did not smile. He hovered for a long moment above them all. He looked down at the people who loved him because they had been told to, and he remembered an old woman with a cane standing in front of a boy whose skin shimmered like blue glass. He looked at his own name on 1,000 screens and remembered a hallway of tanks. He listened to the applause and remembered a red-haired woman walking barefoot across burning grass to teach him, without breaking a single bone, exactly what he was. He landed on the rooftop of Vought. The cameras followed. He waved because waving was what the body did. He smiled because smiling was what the face did. But something in his eyes had gone somewhere the cameras could not reach. And the producers, watching on their monitors, glanced at each other because the shot was, for the first time in his career, not quite right. Meanwhile, half a universe away, an alarm went off in Cerebro. A mutant had manifested in Nairobi. A young girl. Frightened. Storm was already in the air before Xavier had finished reading the coordinates. Cyclops was already briefing the team. Nightcrawler was already saying goodbye to a child he had been reading to in the library. Wolverine was already stubbing out a cigar. Jean was already tying her hair back. The name Homelander did not come up in the briefing. It did not need to. He had been to them a Tuesday. A sad man who had lost his way and been shown the way back to it and been allowed to leave. There were other people to save. Xavier remained on the lawn a moment longer after the others had gone. He looked at the place where the sky had closed. He thought of the boy in the glass room and of the man built around him and of the thin, uncertain thread between what a person is done to and what a person chooses. He hoped, without much confidence and without any bitterness, that the man would choose at least once, differently. Then he turned his chair back toward the school. The greatest battles, he thought, are so rarely fought with fists. They are fought in the quiet rooms inside us, long after the cameras have moved on, long after the crowds have found a new name to shout. They are fought in whether, tomorrow morning, we choose to be a little less afraid and a little more kind. The lights in the mansion came on, one by one, behind him. And somewhere in another world, a man in a red cape stood very still on a rooftop, listening to a crowd chant his name, and, for the first time in his life, heard how empty it sounded.